So in 1962, a man named Clairvius Narcisse walked into a hospital in Haiti with a very mysterious illness. Within days, he was dead. His family held a funeral, mourned his passing, and sadly buried him. But 18 years later, he suddenly showed up out of nowhere in his hometown, very much alive. What he said happened to him after he died was so mysterious and so strange that doctors, scientists, and even the United Nations got involved in his story. The story is not a ghost story, it's not even a conspiracy theory. It is something far scarier because it actually, truly happened. If you are a fan of the unsettling, eerie, dark, or disturbing, then you're definitely in the right place, and welcome to my channel. And I hope that you enjoy this video because it fills all of the above categories. Also, don't forget to subscribe if you do want to see more dark and unsettling content. So like I said in the intro, it all began with a man walking into a hospital. In April of 1962, Clairvius Narcisse arrived at the Albert Schweitzer Hospital, which is situated in a quiet rural town nestled in Haiti's Artibonite Valley. He complained of very intense body pain, fever, coughing fits, and strange sensations like feeling pins and needles under his skin. Over the next few days, his condition worsened very quickly and very suddenly. There were two attending doctors at that time. One was Haitian and one was American, and they observed him and his condition very closely as it worsened. He was responsive at first, but very quickly began deteriorating, and on May 2nd, his body just completely gave out, and both doctors pronounced him dead. His sister Angelina was unfortunately there when they pronounced him dead, and she saw the sheet that they pulled over his face. Family members were notified, preparations were made, and the next day, in accordance with Haitian custom, he was buried in a cemetery near his hometown of La Esther. A stone slab sealed the tomb, bearing the words, "Here rests Clairvius Narcisse, May 2nd, 1962. No one really questioned his death. Obviously, he had died of the illness that he had when he was in hospital. There had been witnesses, there was a body, there was a whole funeral, and there was even a death certificate issued to him, signed and stamped by the hospital itself. For nearly 2 decades, Clairvius's family mourned him. He just became a memory carved in stone. But 18 years later, in that same dusty village marketplace, Clairvius Narcisse would walk out of the crowd alive. And everything his family thought that they knew about death would completely unravel. So the heat in the marketplace that morning was just unrelenting. It was thick, humid, and alive with the chatter of merchants and the metallic clatter of scales measuring rice, beans, and salt. It was the 1980s, and for the people of this dusty Haitian town, it was just another day of bargaining and living in the hustle and bustle of the town culture. Then a man stepped out of the crowd. He was gaunt, wearing second-hand clothes and walking completely barefoot. His eyes were yellowed with age and wear, and his skin had the look of someone who had spent years and years working in the sun. He carried himself very awkwardly, as if unsure where to place his feet and very confused by his surroundings. He looked like a man returned from exile, someone not quite of the world that all of these people were living in. Shortly after he appeared, he approached a woman selling produce. "Angelina," he said, "it's me, Clairvius." The woman turned slowly, squinting against the sun, saw his face, and dropped the basket that she was holding. She screamed, because this was her brother, Clairvius Narcisse, the same brother who had died in 1962, the one that she had mourned, buried. She literally saw him pass away in the hospital, and of course, she never expected to see him again. Panic, of course, broke out into the market because this is a terrifying thing, seeing someone who is supposed to be dead very much alive. People, of course, crowded around him, murmuring, gasping, some crossing themselves, others backing away in fear because they had no idea what was going on. A man who had been dead for 18 years had returned, not as a ghost, but completely in the flesh, probably looking a little bit different, but there nonetheless. The police were obviously called, and he was quickly taken into custody because no one knew what this was. Maybe it was someone stealing his identity, but they didn't take him in as a crime. They just took him in for his own protection. Rumors were already swirling around the town, and with myths and legends and folklore, rumors could turn violent very quickly. So words of his return traveled around the town very quickly. The local radio stations picked up the story immediately. Reporters, doctors, and even members of the clergy began arriving in this town to see for themselves whether the impossible had truly occurred. Some, of course, assumed that it was some cruel joke, maybe just someone who looked a little bit like him, maybe a long-lost twin brother. Others thought that it might be a case of mistaken identity. But when the man was brought before his very own family, the questions began to evaporate. He, of course, remembered everything. He spoke of his childhood memories, of land disputes, of family names, and arguments no one outside of the household could possibly know. He knew way too much for them to think that he was someone else. And still, the most chilling validation came from the past itself. Clairvius was able to point out the exact tomb where he had been buried. He described the pain in his chest before his so-called death and the sensation of being completely unable to move as people wept around him, thinking that he had died. And most disturbingly, he also remembers the very sharp sting of a nail driven through his lip as the coffin was sealed shut with him inside it, very much still alive. His sister said that he was just way too big for the box, and that's why they had to force it shut, and he got this nail driven through his lip. And he said that he just heard his entire funeral. But the really sad part is he couldn't cry out at all. He remembered the feeling of being completely buried alive. And then he said, a boca came. In Haitian Voodoo belief, a boca is a sorcerer, often feared but sometimes respected. This person works with both good and bad spirits. They are said to have the power to capture a person's soul, summon spirits, or even raise the dead into a state of will-less servitude. Clairvius claimed that on the third night in his tomb, he was of course still alive. The boca came with assistance. They performed a ceremony. The coffin lid just flew open, he said. Then they struck him across the face, tied him with rope, and led him away somewhere unknown. Years and years after he was rediscovered and they had found him, they asked Clairvius while he sat beneath the shade of a mango tree in his family's compound to tell the story of this whole ordeal about being buried alive and about this boca taking him away. And he was just surrounded by chickens, dusty air, and a very curious crowd. His shirt was clean, not like that first day that they found him. His voice calm, but his words were translated very carefully by a local interpreter, and these words painted a story that completely chilled the spine. This, he said, is what happened after he was buried. He remembered the sound of the sand hitting the coffin, the scraping pain in his chest, and he said that he could hear his sisters crying above him, hear the coffin nails being hammered shut. He even got injured from one. He tried to scream, to move, to signal that he was still alive, but nothing worked. He said that he knew that he was dead, and that is why they pronounced him dead. He couldn't speak, but he was completely there, completely conscious, completely aware of what was happening. He didn't really know how long he lay there. Time was just completely a blur, and his mind faded in and out of sleep. But on the third night that he was buried alive, something changed. The earth opened, is what he said, and he was summoned by this boca. While all of this was happening and they were doing this ritual, he said that he was not conscious in the way that we would think of consciousness, but he does remember the event. They walked him away from the cemetery, away from Les Esters, into the rural backroads of Haiti until they arrived at a sugar plantation near the town of Palate. And there, hidden behind trees and guarded by fear, Narcisse was immediately put to work. He said that there were other people, many other people, over 150, he actually said. He said that they moved very silently through the fields, planting and harvesting sugarcane, digging in the hot sun, carrying water in metal drums. And their movements were very stiff and methodical. No one spoke, no one ran. They were literally like puppets without strings, their minds dulled and their spirits completely hollow, literally like people void of a soul. Some, he believed, had been there for years and years. He said that most nights they were fed a meager paste made from sweet potatoes and saltless porridge. The boca gave them very occasional doses of a bitter-tasting substance called the zombie cucumber, which was meant to just keep them docile and confused. It left Narcisse in a very mental fog, which was a place where he couldn't recall who he was or why he was there and how exactly he ended up there. It was only much later he explained that he understood the boca had taken his soul, or at least a part of it that gave him his will. In Voodoo belief, the soul is split into different parts. One of those parts, which is called the Tibon Ang, is responsible for memory, awareness, and identity, Without it, the person is adrift, vulnerable to control, and this is what the Boca had taken from him. And without his Tibonang, Narcisse said he had no choice but to obey what the Boca was telling him to do. He was basically a slave and a zombie. He literally became a living body without any will. And then 2 years later, it ended as suddenly as it began. His nightmare was finally over. One day, a new zombie arrived, and unlike the others, this man was not passive at all. He was very angry, defiant, and just not following any of the rules. Within weeks, he actually rose up and killed the Boca in a burst of violence, and in the confusion, Narcisse fled. I'm guessing it was just instinctual. He was probably just really scared. Once he fled, he wandered into the mountains, then down through villages, surviving on scraps that he could find on the floor and in the mountains. And gradually, he said, as he just ate normal food and drank some clean water, he began to remember who he was, and his consciousness began to slowly come back to him. According to Voodoo tradition, salt had power. It reawakens the spirit, and with this normal food that he had been eating, there was obviously salt in it, so this was now reawakening his spirit. Apparently, it also breaks the spell of the voodoo. As Narcisse consumed his food with his salt, he claimed his soul just slowly returned to him. He became a man again, but a man with nowhere to go and with no clue where his home was. For years and years, he drifted across Haiti, fearful of being discovered by the Boca again. He believed his brothers, the ones who had orchestrated his zombification in the first place, might still want him gone, so he was just forever hiding from these people in hopes of not returning to the sugar plantation. It wasn't until both had died that he finally returned to his hometown of La Este. Like I said earlier, in the marketplace, he approached his sister Angelina, whispered her name, and waited. When she screamed, he knew the spell had broken, because he felt this very intense emotion of seeing his family again. So this whole story was told from the mouth of Clairvius himself. Very special, and I'm very glad that he got to see his family again. So not long after Clairvius's return, word reached a man who had been quietly chasing shadows for years. Okay, we have a friend that has joined us. And this man was Dr. Lamarck Doyon, which is one of Haiti's very few trained psychiatrists, and he had long harbored a professional obsession, the zombie question and how they are made. For most of the outside world, of course, zombies are the stuff of horror movies, walking corpses in Hollywood films, or superstitious folktales from the Caribbean. But to Doyon, they presented something a lot more troubling and possibly more real, which was an intersection of culture, medicine, and belief. Haiti, after all, is a land where Western science coexists with century-old traditions of voodoo, and in voodoo, zombies were not a myth at all, they were cautionary tales. Doyon's interest dated back to the late 1950s when he was still a medical student in Montreal. There he had witnessed experimental drugs administered to schizophrenic patients, sedatives and antipsychotics that left them passive, slow, devoid of initiative, and kind of like a zombie. Watching their vacant expressions and very puppet-like movements, he couldn't help but think of the descriptions that he had heard in his youth they were behaving like zombies. He returned to Haiti. He, of course, began investigating the zombie reports. He was interviewing witnesses, reading court documents, and chasing down rumors in remote villages. But each time he just arrived way too late, or the stories fell apart. People had been hearing of these zombie slaves that had just shown up out of nowhere for a very long time, but he just never managed to catch one. Not catch literally, but obviously just meet one. The phenomenon remained elusive, frustratingly out of reach for this man. Until 1980, when the case of Clairvius landed on his desk like a thunderclap. For the first time, Doyon had a subject who wasn't just a former zombie in the abstract. Narcisse literally had a death certificate. He had a family who said that they swore they saw him buried, and now he was back, walking, talking, and completely himself, definitely the person that had passed away. Doyon wasted no time. He brought Narcisse to a private psychiatric clinic in Port-au-Prince, where he observed and treated him over the course of a full year. He conducted interviews not only with Narcisse but also with his sisters and community members who had attended the funeral in the first place. Every detail added up. He definitely was not a lookalike or a village icon. This was, by every medical and legal account, the exact same man who had been buried 18 years earlier. Even more compelling was Narcisse's mental state. He wasn't delusional or hallucinating. His memory was completely intact. Like I said earlier, he recounted lots of things from his childhood and from his burial to a T. He recalled conversations, grievances, and the names of physicians who had treated him much earlier in his life. He was very aware of what happened to him, or at least what he believed had happened. He told the exact same story again and again. He'd been buried alive, he had been raised by a boca, and he had been enslaved on a remote farm with dozens of others in a trance-like state. To Doyon, this wasn't just a cultural curiosity, it was literally a psychiatric case that challenged the foundations of Western medicine. How on earth did this man die and then become alive again? Was it possible that a person could be induced into a death-like state through drugs or a ritual, then reawakened and mentally controlled in some sort of a trance? Could there be a rational or clinical explanation behind the zombie legend? His conclusions were very cautious but clear. Clairvius Narcisse was not a fraud. He had in some way experienced a form of zombification. Doyon's findings ended up being very revolutionary in Haitian medicine, but largely ignored by the outside world, unfortunately, until his report reached an unlikely audience, a Harvard ethnobotanist named Wade Davis, who would take the zombie files and dig even deeper. If Doyon was the scientist who validated the phenomenon, Davis would be the one to chase its roots, to climb into the shadows of Haiti's spiritual underworld and unearth the poison, the ritual, and the secret. So Wade Davis had studied under someone called Richard Evans Schultz, one of the foremost authorities on hallucinogenic plants, and he was no stranger to remote jungles or spiritual ceremonies. Still, Haiti would prove to be his most dangerous fieldwork yet. In 1982, Davis arrived in Haiti with a question that had confounded scientists for decades. If zombies were real, how on earth were they made? He began as an ethnobotanist would by going straight to the source, the bocas. Voodoo sorcerers were said to be capable of creating zombies. It was a very perilous journey. Bocas were feared figures, rumored to deal in very dark magic, poisons, and even human sacrifice. Many were also tied to Haiti's very violent past, including the infamous Tonton Macutus, which is a very brutal group that was loyal to former President Francois Papadoc Duvalier. But Davis had a gift for earning trust. He moved very carefully, respectfully, and immersed himself in the cultural codes of Voodoo. Eventually, one boca, Marcel Pierre, which was a former Tonton Macuta with a very chilling reputation, agreed to speak with him. After an initial ruse with a fake potion, Pierre finally handed over what Davis believed was the real thing, the actual zombie poison that bocas used to make these people their slaves. Back in the US, Davis had the sample analyzed in a lab. The ingredients were shocking and quite deadly. The core of the poison was built around a very potent neurotoxin called tetrodotoxin, found in the skin and the organs of a pufferfish. In very minute doses, this toxin can cause complete paralysis while leaving the victim fully conscious. Respiration lows, heart rate drops, the body becomes completely rigid. In some cases, the victims do appear clinically dead, unable to move, unable to speak, and unable to even blink, yet aware of everything happening around him. So I think that these people must have poisoned him with this toxin before he had died, and that's probably what made him so sick, and that's why doctors did not know that he wasn't dead. In Japan, where pufferfish, or also known as fugu, is considered a delicacy, deaths from tetrodotoxin poisoning are very well documented. They've happened a lot. Some victims have quite literally been declared dead, only to revive later, terrified and disoriented, on their way to the morgue. Davis now believed that this very toxin, when administered in precise amounts, could quite literally mimic death closely enough to deceive doctors, families, and coroners. But the poison alone wasn't enough. This zombie poison was only the very first phase of this process. According to bocas, after the victim dies, they are buried sometimes for days. Of course, they are supposed to be buried forever. Then the Boca returns, digs them up, and feeds them a second concoction known as the zombie cucumber, a hallucinogenic mixture believed to destroy memory and just completely suppress your free will. The victim then becomes very disoriented, traumatized, often starved of oxygen, and then from there they are taken away and forced into servitude from the Boca. A zombie is then created, not through death and resurrection, but purely through chemistry, ritual, and psychological shock. Davis also found that the ingredients actually varied across regions, kind of like recipes passed down through oral tradition. Some poisons contained toxins from toads, crushed tarantulas, or even ground human bone, not for chemical effect, but probably as a spiritual catalyst. It wasn't just pharmacology, it was pharmacology embedded in belief and very, very old tradition. The ritual mattered quite as much as the substance itself. David realized that science could explain part of the zombification process, but definitely not all of it, because a person dosed with tetrodotoxin and buried alive might survive, and they might even be revived later, but what made them stay a zombie, docile, black-eyed, and obedient for years and years, that definitely couldn't be explained by drugs alone. He said he believed that there was something far deeper at work, a cultural framework of belief, fear, and control that allowed the zombification process to take complete hold of people's brains. And to understand that, Davis wanted to go far beyond the science and into the rituals of the secret societies. He wanted to join them. It was, of course, a very dangerous gamble. These people were known to dabble in human sacrifice, so I think he knew what he was getting himself into, but he went anyway. These were obviously not clubs or religious orders as the West would understand them. Haiti's secret societies were often very invisible to foreign eyes. They were buried very deep in dark jungles. They were placed far away from town and society and functioned as parallel institutions of justice and control, particularly in the rural regions where state power was very weak and very absent. In these societies, Bocas weren't just sorcerers, they were quite literally enforcers, judges, and executioners. They upheld a form of traditional law older than the Haitian state itself, so no one cared to fuck with them. To violate that law, their law, by stealing from the community, betraying kin, or disrupting social harmony, could invite punishment, and in rare cases, that punishment was zombification. Not a random curse, but quite literally a sentence for years and years and years. Davis's mentor, Professor Richard Scult, received a letter from his students in the field during this time. It read like a missive from a different world. This is what the letter read. We have completely infiltrated the secret society. We've been given the passwords, the ritualistic handshakes and forms of address, and the magic formulae of the poisons. The next phase is called the neurotoxins, the hard night. It includes a blood oath and the consumption of a toxic preparation. No white has ever gone through it. I am most anxious to obtain the ingredients of this toxic preparation. Davis had quite literally found the crack in the door, but stepping through it meant risking everything, risking his life quite literally. In one very chilling encounter, the Boca Marcel Pierre that I had spoken about before, who was now Davis's very uneasy guide, gave him a real dose of this zombie poison that he had used on his own slaves. Davis pretended to rub it in his hands. Pierre turned to Davis's assistant and said coldly, "The blank is going to die," which means this white person is going to die. But in a strange twist of psychology, Davis didn't die. His survival won Pierre's respect, actually. It wasn't just bravery, it was what Davis would later call the dance, which was just a performance, a test, and a demonstration of cultural fluency. The test was that if he had flinched, shown fear, or ran away from this ritual, it might have confirmed their suspicion that outsiders couldn't be trusted and that he was there for alternate reasons, other than, wanting to learn their culture and wanting to be part of their society. But instead, Davis played the part fully. He dared, and so the door opened wider. Through his months in Haiti, David uncovered so much more than toxins and poisons. He found a coherent worldview, a system in which zombification made sense for these people, not as a horror, but as a social consequence for just defying these bocas. A person could be sentenced to zombification not because they had enemies, but because they had just broken rules that were much older than colonization, older than independence, rules about land, kinship, and obligation. And the Boca in these cases wasn't just a villain. He was quite literally fulfilling a role the community had sanctioned. One of the Bocas even told Davis that the society must survive and those who threaten it must be dealt with, and that is why they make zombies. The Boca didn't always act alone though. In some cases, the families requested punishment. The zombification of Clairvius Narcisse, Davis would learn, was believed to be ordered by his very own brothers after a dispute over family land that he had tried to sell without their consent. There was no magic involved. He was poisoned and he was turned into a zombie because he broke some rules, and that was his punishment. By the end of his time in Haiti, Davis had entered the very edge of the initiation rite, the Voodoo. But before completing it, he fell gravely ill with malaria, hepatitis, and dysentery. Exhausted and hallucinating, he returned to the US to recover and write all of his findings that he had discovered during his time in Haiti. He hadn't actually become a Boca, but he had seen the dance. So like I said earlier, in Narcisse's case, researchers uncovered that this dispute may have started with land, and that is why he got this punishment in the first place. After their father's death, Narcisse and his siblings jointly inherited a piece of farmland, but Narcisse wanted to sell his share, something he was of course legally entitled to do under Haitian civil law. Yet by doing so, he would have displaced several relatives who relied on that very land to survive. So to the eyes of the state, it was a property issue, but to the eyes of the Voodoo Society, it was complete betrayal to his family, and that betrayal, of course, had consequences. According to Max Bova, a Cornell and Sorbonne trained biochemist, who also happened to be one of Haiti's most respected Hungans or Voodoo priests, Narcisse's zombification followed a traditional process of judgment. And this means that Narcisse had been warned. Elders and spiritual leaders had pleaded with him to change his course of action and to just rethink what he was doing. And when he refused, he was taken before a council of the society, tried by his peers, and then sentenced. Zombification was not chaos. It was quite literally a form of capital punishment, death in body but not in form. It was just a way to torture people who had done something completely wrong. In this view, Narcisse's zombification was not a freak event. It was part of a social logic formed by the society. A man steps outside of his bounds of tradition, he is warned, he refuses, he's judged, and then he is made into a zombie as punishment. Davis would later write that zombification was not merely a criminal act, it was a mechanism of control, a way for traditional society to police its own members when the modern state could not or would not intervene. And that is probably the most disturbing truth of all, because it meant that Narcisse wasn't alone and there were others. People were quite literally punishing and torturing other people according to their own beliefs, and the state was doing nothing about it. And Dr. Dion did also discover a second zombie, and many of them, like the second one, never truly came back. When Davis met the zombie, she barely spoke. She stared into space, her movements were slow and unsure. She sat beneath a mango tree as children played nearby, but she didn't really seem to notice them. Her T-Bon Ang, that piece of her soul that had her free will, never truly returned to her. Some zombies, it seems, never escaped their sentence, and I think that is terrifying because it might still be happening around us and we wouldn't know because we don't venture into those edges of society where these rituals and these beliefs are taking place. Clairvius Narcisse was definitely one of the lucky few. And there you have it. That is the story of a real zombie who died, came back to life, and returned to his family. And I hope that you enjoyed it. It's very unsettling, it's very scary to think about, and I would not wish that upon my worst enemy. I feel like death is better than what these people have to go through being a zombie and pretty much working as a slave under a burqa. But thank you so much for watching. If you have reached the end, please don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed this, and please don't forget to subscribe for more creepy, spooky, scary, disturbing content. And I will see you next week. Bye.